My grandson thought I had abandoned him on purpose. Let that sit for a moment before I explain anything else. Not that I was busy, not that I had moved away, not that I was struggling with something private I hadn't shared, abandoned, on purpose. That was the story his mother gave him, and for 9 months he carried it the way a boy carries something he's ashamed to say out loud, which is exactly why it took me so long to find out I was carrying it too. I'm Walter Grady. I'm 68 years old. I spent 34 years running the parts counter and then the whole service department at a Ford dealership outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And if there's one thing 3 decades of that work teaches you, it's how to read a person who's telling you half of what's actually wrong with their car. You learn to listen for the thing underneath the thing. I bring that up because it matters later. Because for 9 months, I did not listen closely enough to what was underneath what my daughter was telling me, and a 6-year-old boy named Dexter paid for that. Dexter is my daughter, Melissa's son. She's 33. Her husband, Dexter's father, was named Cole, and he died in a highway accident 4 years ago when Dexter was 2 years old. I want to be careful here, because this is not a story where I villainize my daughter without cause, and if you're expecting a simple monster, you're not going to get one from me. Melissa is not a monster. Melissa is a woman who lost her husband at 29 years old and has spent every year since trying to control something, anything, in a life that taught her, brutally and without warning, that control is mostly an illusion. What happened between us did not come from cruelty. It came from fear wearing cruelty's clothes, which in practice looks exactly the same to the person standing on the other side of it. After Cole died, I became something like a second father to that boy. Not because I was trying to replace anyone. Because Melissa needed help, and because Dexter needed a man in his life who showed up on Saturdays, and because I had the kind of retirement schedule that let me be that man without complaint. I taught him to fish at the reservoir off Route 22. I built him a treehouse in my backyard. The summer he turned 4, badly, with more nails than the instructions called for, and he loved it anyway because it was his. I have a shelf in my garage, waist height, that has held his rain boots and his baseball glove and a coffee can full of the specific brand of butterscotch candies he liked since he was old enough to ask for them by name. That shelf has been restocked every single month since 2022. I want you to remember that shelf. It comes back later. The trouble started, if I trace it honestly, at Dexter's 5th birthday party. Melissa had started dating a man named Trevor about 8 months prior. Trevor was, by every account I could gather at the time, a decent enough man on the surface, works in commercial insurance, drives a truck he keeps too clean, laughs a beat too late at his own jokes. At that party, in front of Melissa's side of the family and a dozen of Dexter's classmates and their parents, Trevor made an offhand comment about how he was looking forward to being Dexter's real dad once things were official. I watched my grandson's face when he heard that. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. And he got quiet in a way 5-year-olds don't usually get quiet. And I said something. I didn't yell. I have never once raised my voice at that man. I simply said, calmly, that Dexter already had a father, and that his father's memory deserved better than being replaced out loud at his own son's birthday party. I said it to Trevor directly, in front of everyone, because I believed, and still believe, that some things need to be corrected the moment they happen, or they harden into something worse. I was right to say something. I was wrong about how. I've turned that over more times than I can count in the 2 years since. There is a way to be right that still manages to humiliate someone, and I found it that afternoon in Melissa's backyard, and I watched her face go, the particular shade of still that meant she was not going to forgive this at the volume it happened in front of. I apologized to her 3 days later. Called her, told her I'd overstepped, that Trevor didn't deserve to be corrected like a customer disputing a warranty in front of a room full of people. She said she heard me. She did not say she forgave me. I told myself that was fine. That things settle. I had raised her myself, alone, after her mother passed when Melissa was 11, and I believed, the way you believe things about people you raised, that we were solid enough to survive one bad afternoon. What I didn't understand, not for months, was that Melissa had already made a decision that day. Not one, she announced. One she simply began to build, quietly, brick by brick, the way people do when they've decided the person who hurt them doesn't get to be trusted with what matters most to them anymore. It didn't happen all at once. That's the part I need you to hold on to, because the slowness of it is exactly what let it go on as long as it did. In March, our standing Saturday breakfasts, a ritual since Dexter was 3, simply stopped appearing on the calendar. I called Melissa. She said she and Trevor needed some time, as a new family unit finding its footing. The words new family unit landed strange in my ear, formal in a way that Melissa never talked, like she was reading off something she'd rehearsed or been told to say. I gave them the time. In April, I sent Dexter a card for the last day of kindergarten, with 2 butterscotch candies taped inside because I knew the coffee can in my garage wasn't reaching him anymore. 3 weeks later, I asked about it. Melissa said he got it, said thank you. Not to me, to her. Like I was a stranger who'd sent a gift through a middleman. In May, I drove out to their house on a Sunday with a bag from the hardware store, wood glue and sandpaper, because Dexter had mentioned the treehouse railing was coming loose, and I wanted to fix it myself, the way I always had. Trevor's truck was in the driveway. Melissa's car too. I knocked. I waited. I knocked again. Through the front window, I could see the television on, the blue flicker of it moving across the living room wall. Nobody came. I stood on that porch for almost 2 minutes, long enough to understand it wasn't a bad moment I'd caught them in. It was a decision, dressed up as an ordinary Sunday. I called Melissa that night and told her plainly what I'd seen and what I thought it meant. She said things were complicated right now with Trevor's schedule and hers, and that she needed more space. I asked how much space. She said she didn't know yet. That answer, I don't know yet, is one I've thought about more than almost anything else in this whole story, because it isn't really an answer. It's a door being closed slowly enough that you can't point to the exact moment it shut. June, July, August. I called, I texted, I left voicemails that were never returned, not one. I sent a card for no occasion at all in July, just to let a 6-year-old boy know somebody outside that house was still thinking about him. I don't know if it ever reached him. I drove past that house 3 more times that summer. The blue flicker of that television was always on. Nobody ever answered. In September, Melissa called me. 6 minutes, start to finish. She said Trevor had proposed, that they were engaged, that things were going to be, in her words, simpler, once the wedding was behind them, and they could establish some healthy boundaries as a family. I asked, carefully, what those boundaries were going to look like for me and Dexter. She said we'd talk about it after the wedding. I said okay. I did not push. I have wondered, in the 2 years since, whether I should have pushed harder in that exact conversation, and I've decided that's a useless question, because hindsight will always hand you a better version of yourself than the one who actually lived through the moment, not knowing what came next. In October, I stopped calling, not because I'd given up on my grandson, because I understood, finally, that the calls weren't reaching anyone who had the power or the will to change anything, and I needed to stop spending myself on a door that had already decided not to open, and start figuring out what else I could do that didn't depend on Melissa changing her mind. What I didn't know, what I would not find out for another 4 months, was that sometime in November, Melissa sat my grandson down and told him that Grandpa Walter didn't want to see him anymore, that Grandpa was busy with his own life now, that some grown-ups just stop caring about kids sometimes, and it wasn't Dexter's fault, but it was just how it was, and it was time for their new family, the 3 of them, Melissa and Trevor and Dexter, to move forward. I did not learn this until the following March, from a woman named Ruth Callahan, who ran the front desk at Dexter's elementary school, and who I'd known for years because I used to be on the approved pickup list back when Melissa was working late shifts at the hospital lab. Ruth called me on a Tuesday evening. She said she didn't feel right, not telling me. She said Dexter had been in the front office that afternoon waiting on his mother, and another child, a classmate of his, had asked why his grandpa never picked him up anymore, like some of the other kids' grandpas did. And Dexter had said, flat and matter of fact, the way kids repeat things adults told them before they had their own words for it, my grandpa doesn't want me anymore. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for what I later realized, checking the clock, was 26 minutes. I want to tell you what that felt like, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of dramatic, and that's the part that stays with me. The street was doing what streets do on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Someone's sprinkler running 2 houses down. A neighbor's dog barking at nothing in particular. The whole unremarkable world continuing on, indifferent to the fact that mine had just come apart in the front seat of a Ford I'd sold myself. I thought about the day I taught Dexter to fish. 5 years old, too small for the rod I'd bought him, casting it wrong 7 times in a row, snagging his own line twice, and never once getting frustrated, just looking up at me after every failed cast to check whether my face said this was something worth trying again. I kept my face calm every time. I told him to reel it in and try again. On the 8th cast, the line went out clean and true, and he looked at me like he'd just discovered something permanent about who he was. I thought about that shelf in my garage, the rain boots, the baseball glove, the coffee can. I thought about a boy standing in an elementary school hallway telling another child that his grandfather simply didn't want him anymore, believing it, carrying it into everyday since, and I understood, with a kind of clarity that comes maybe twice in a man's life, exactly what I needed to do next. I did not call Melissa. I called Denise Okafor instead. Denise is my attorney. 59 years old, family law practice on the 2nd floor of a building on Market Street, and she's handled my affairs, my will, a property dispute with a neighbor years back, since 2011. She has the particular calm of a woman who has heard nearly everything a family can do to itself, and long ago stopped being surprised by any of it, which means when you sit across from her holding something that would rattle most people, she meets it with exactly the steadiness it requires, instead of the shock it might otherwise provoke. I told her everything, start to finish, from the birthday party to Ruth Callahan's phone call, in order, without dressing it up, because Denise doesn't need dressing up. She needs facts, laid out plainly. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, not confused, deciding. She set her pen down, looked at me, and said she was sorry, and she said it like a person first and a lawyer second. Then she moved into the second part, because that's what I needed from her. She told me that telling a minor child a living grandparent doesn't want them, when that grandparent has documented, sustained attempts at contact, can absolutely factor into a grandparent visitation petition under Pennsylvania family law, especially where a parent's remarriage is actively displacing an existing relationship. She said it would need documentation. Real documentation, not just my word. She told me to go home, pull together every record I had, and be back in her office at 8 the next morning. I went home and found the notebook I'd started keeping back in March, back when the Saturday breakfasts first stopped. Not because I expected to need it for anything legal, but because 34 years of tracking parts, inventory, and warranty claims trains a certain instinct into a man that never fully goes away. Every unanswered call, every unreturned text, with the date and time. The porch visit in May, written out in full. The card in July. I printed my phone records. I printed what texts I could recover. I was at Denise's office by 5 minutes to 8. We worked until almost 10. Then she told me to go to the school. Now this next part is the piece people always want to know about when I tell this story, so stay with me here, because I've never described this to anyone outside of Denise and, eventually, my daughter. Fairview Elementary had never taken me off the approved pickup list. Nobody had ever thought to. I'd been on it since Dexter's first week of kindergarten, back when Melissa was working overnight shifts, and I was the one who got him to school half the mornings that year. I arrived at 11:40 on a Thursday morning wearing a sport coat I don't wear often, because I understood that how a man presents himself is its own kind of statement, and I wanted to communicate exactly what I was. A grandfather, with legal standing, and complete composure. I'd slept maybe 4 hours. I didn't let it show. 34 years on a dealership floor teaches you to walk into a room like you belong there, no matter what's happening underneath. I gave my name at the front office. Ruth wasn't working that shift, but the woman at the desk recognized the name on the screen immediately, confirmed I was still listed, asked if I needed anything for his return. I told her he'd be home with his mother by evening. She called down to his classroom. I stood at the counter and looked at a bulletin board covered in construction paper leaves, each one with a first grader's name on it, while I waited, and my heart was doing something I hadn't felt it do in years. Dexter came around the corner with a teacher's aide, looking at his shoes the way kids do when they've been pulled out of class and don't know why, and then he looked up, and he saw me, and he stopped completely still. Not for long. For that one particular fraction of a second, a person needs, when the world hands them something their understanding of reality had already ruled out. His grandfather, standing in his school office, when his grandfather didn't want him anymore. And then he ran. He didn't say a word. Kids who feel something that big and that true usually don't, at first. They just move toward it and hold on. He wrapped both arms around my waist, and I put my hand on the back of his head, and we stood there in that front office, neither one of us saying anything, and the woman behind the desk found something very important to look at on her computer screen. The way people do when they understand a moment doesn't need witnesses. I signed him out. I thanked her. We walked to my truck. There's a diner 2 blocks from that school, the Lantern, red vinyl booths, a laminated menu that hasn't changed in a decade, coffee that's been on the burner since 6 that morning. We took a booth near the back. I ordered him a grilled cheese, because it's what he'd always ordered since he was old enough to order for himself. And I got a black coffee. I mostly didn't drink because I wasn't thinking about coffee. We talked about first grade, about a book his class was reading, about a dog that could talk to birds, about whether his soccer team had a game that weekend. I did not ask him one single question about his mother, or about Trevor, or about what he'd been told. He was 6 years old. That wasn't a conversation for him to navigate, it was mine. When his ice cream came, because of course it came, there was never a version of that afternoon where I said no to ice cream. He looked at it for a second and then looked straight at me, the direct way 6-year-olds do before the world teaches them not to, and asked if I still loved him. I told him I loved him every single day, every single one, and that nothing had ever changed that, not once, and that whatever he'd been told wasn't true. He nodded, satisfied, the way kids do when an adult confirms something they'd hoped was true the whole time, and went back to his ice cream like the weight of it had genuinely lifted off him right there in that booth. While he ate, I sent one text to Denise. Just that I'd be calling soon. She wrote back 2 words. Ready when you are. Melissa called at 1:50 that afternoon. The phone lit up on the table beside my coffee cup. Dexter saw his mother's name on the screen and looked at me with that same caught between two things look he'd had walking into the office. I told him everything was fine, that I'd step outside to take it. He nodded and went back to drawing something on his placemat with the crayons the waitress had left. I walked toward the back hallway, near the restrooms, quiet enough to hear and far enough that he wouldn't catch the specifics of what was coming. I answered. What came through that phone for the next 30 seconds was not a conversation. It was a woman who believed she was in complete control of a situation, finding out in real time that she wasn't, and reacting with the full force of that discovery. The word kidnapping came up, then the word police, then, finally, the word lawyer, which was the only word in the whole outburst that actually interested me, because it told me that somewhere underneath the volume, she already understood this wasn't going to be resolved by yelling. I waited for the pause that always comes once a person's said everything they'd rehearsed and is waiting to hear what it landed on. When it came, I said 3 things, clearly, without rushing any of them. I told her Dexter was safe, was with me, and would be home by 6. I told her that my attorney, Denise Okafor, was currently sitting in her office with a folder documenting 8 months of contact attempts, phone records, a handwritten log, and a written statement from a school employee describing what Dexter had said in that hallway. And I told her Denise was available to speak with any attorney Melissa chose to retain at any time she liked. Then I put the phone on speaker, not because Melissa was still talking, because Denise, who I'd called from my truck before I ever walked into that school that morning, and whose line had been open and recording since before I gave my name at the front desk, needed Melissa to understand that this conversation had an audience it had had for hours. Denise introduced herself in that specific tone she has, capable without being aggressive about it. The tone of someone who's had every version of this conversation before and isn't rattled by any of them. She gave her name. Said she represented me. Said she was aware of the situation and had been documenting it, and that she'd be glad to speak with Melissa's attorney whenever one was retained. The call ended not long after that. I stood in that hallway a moment. Then I walked back to the booth. Dexter had finished his ice cream and moved on to coloring the whole placemat in one determined shade of blue. I sat back down and finished my coffee, gone cold by then, but I finished it anyway, because it was there, and because finishing things is a habit 34 years of this life never let go of. We talked another half hour about nothing important and everything that mattered. I drove him home at 5:40, walked him to the door. Melissa opened it before I reached the porch steps. The look on her face wasn't the phone call anymore. It was quieter than that. The look of someone who's run new numbers and landed on an answer she hadn't expected that morning. I told Dexter I'd see him soon. He hugged me hard around the middle one more time and went inside. I told Melissa that Denise would be in touch, and I walked back to my truck. What came after, over the next few months, I want to describe carefully, because it wasn't simple, and I don't want to make it sound simpler than it was. Melissa called me that night. Her voice had the particular strain of somebody trying to hold two true things that don't want to fit together at once. She wasn't defending what she'd said to Dexter. She also wasn't fully admitting it yet. Not in those exact words. We talked for over an hour, longer than we'd talked in 8 months. She told me, eventually, that Trevor had encouraged her, more than once, to tell Dexter something that would stop him from asking to see me, because the asking, she said, was making things harder for the new family they were trying to build. She said she knew, even as she said the words to her own son, that it was wrong. She said it anyway. She was sorry, and she said it knowing the word wasn't big enough for the size of what she'd done, and that knowledge was right there in her voice alongside the apology. Denise filed a petition for grandparent visitation within the week, not because either of us expected it to reach a courtroom, because a filed petition, backed by a documented folder, produces a kind of clarity in a family dispute that private phone calls almost never manage on their own. It says, "This is real now, and it's on the record." Melissa retained an attorney. That attorney called Denise within 5 days and, according to Denise, sounded like a man who'd read the folder closely and had already advised his client that mediation was a considerably smarter path than a hearing. Denise agreed. We went through 2 sessions. The first was tense, both sides feeling out the room. The second was where the real work happened. What came out of it was a formal, signed, notarized agreement. Every other weekend with Dexter. 2 weeks in the summer, dates set every February for the year ahead. A rotating holiday schedule mapped out through 2029. And one clause, Denise wrote herself, which Melissa's attorney accepted without a single word changed, stating plainly that neither parent nor any future spouse could make any statement to the child about the grandparents' feelings, availability, or standing in the family that wasn't true, that the child would never again be used as a message between the adults. Denise wrote it in language simple enough that a first grader could follow it if it were ever read out loud to him. I asked her to make sure of that on purpose. Dexter came to my house the first Saturday under the new agreement. 9 in the morning, right on time. He went straight to the backyard to check on the treehouse, the railing still a little loose because I'd never gotten the chance to fix it. Then he came inside and went straight to the garage, to that shelf, waist height, and stood in front of it for a second. The rain boots, the glove, the coffee can. Everything exactly where it had always been, restocked every month, even during the 8 months. I didn't know if he'd ever come stand in front of it again. He looked at me and said, "You kept it all." I told him I always would. He nodded, the way a kid nods when the world confirms something he'd always hoped was true underneath everything else, and he grabbed the coffee can and went to find a spot on the porch to eat butterscotch candy in the sun. Before I let you go, I want to say something plain, because I know some of you listening are living some version of what I just told you. If you're a grandfather or a grandmother being cut off from a grandchild who is being told things about you that aren't true, I need you to hear this clearly. That bond doesn't belong to the parent who's currently deciding to withhold it. It belongs to you and to that child both. Built one Saturday at a time, one fishing trip, one treehouse, one restocked shelf at a time, and there are legal paths built specifically to protect it when someone tries to take it away by lying instead of by right. Get the lawyer. Keep the notebook. Write down every unanswered call, every unopened door, every date, because that notebook is what turns a broken family moment into a case somebody in a courtroom has to take seriously. It's the difference between a grandparent who was wronged and a grandparent who can prove it. And understand this, if somebody tells a child you stopped loving them, that lie does not hold. It comes apart the moment that child sees your face again in a place they didn't expect to. It comes apart in a boy running full speed across a school office floor into your arms. You are not gone from that child's life just because someone said so out loud. You are still exactly who you always were to them. Nobody gets to take that away permanently. They can only stall it. And the stalling ends the day you decide it does. If somebody in your life stood by you the way I'm talking about, drop their name in the comments. Tell me who never gave up on showing up. I want to read every single one.